Hello, Garland Nixon hanging out with Peter Erickson. He's a geopolitical analyst from one of my favorite YouTube shows. It's called Conversation Amongst the Ruins. He does that with his son, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I'm very, very fortunate to have him hang out with us on our YouTube channel. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Peter Erickson. Peter, welcome and thanks a lot for hanging out with us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right, let's get started. So, Operation True Promise 3 is underway. You know, the Israelis got the first punch in. Some interesting dynamics there to discuss. But let's talk about what's happening right now. Let's be up to date before we go any further with this. And that is, I'm watching video online, and it seems to me that the Iranians are knocking the crap out of Israel with missiles. I also see reports that either 2 or 3 F-35s have been shot down, that a pilot apparently has been captured, and they're saying they don't know about the location or whether or not the other pilot survived. So there's some things going on. It appears that it's not as one-sided as it was. People were discussing this as though this is one-sided and Israel just hit them and Iran's out of the fight, and it certainly seems like that is your thoughts.
Yeah, well, clearly Israel was surprised. I think that they were expecting an attack, but I didn't think they were expecting it quite so soon. And what we've learned is that they wrongly placed trust in their American interlocutors, the negotiators that they're dealing with. There was, I think it was the 5th or the 6th round of negotiations was scheduled for Sunday in Oman. And the Israelis, in fact, made some kind of statement that, we're going to wait until after that, and then we'll make a decision about whether or not to attack. So I was thinking, and I think the Iranians were thinking, and perhaps they had been led to believe this again by the Americans that they were in contact with, that nothing was going to happen for at least a few days. They knew something could happen fairly soon, but not when it did happen, which was last night. So they were caught by surprise, and they suffered the consequences. It was not only an attack from outside their borders, but actually from within their territory. It appears that there was something very similar to Operation Spiderweb. And some reports are saying that this actually was years in the making. At least they've been collecting intelligence. Maybe they didn't start to work out the details of this particular operation until a year or two ago. It's been a great deal of effort and time was put into this. And it succeeded, you have to say, in surprising the Iranians and doing some real harm to them. Killed some of their top leaders, the commander-in-chief of the IGRC, for example, an advisor to the supreme leader, other top generals. I think 6 scientists, they're saying, nuclear scientists. So this was, and they also hit a lot of, I guess, air defense installations. Again, this apparently was with the drones, and I think not just drones, from what I understand. Okay, they used drones that they launched from within Iranian territory, but they also had some other kind of missile that Israeli special forces apparently operated. This is according to Scott Ritter. And then there was just outright sabotage. At least I've heard those reports. That some of these radars, for example, maybe somebody went in there and clipped the wires or something just a couple of days ago, and I don't know what it would entail, but they severely damaged their air defense, and it made it possible for the Israelis to do the damage that they did. Now, if you remember, in past attacks, the Israelis, would fly across Iraq, approach the Iraqi border, and about 100 kilometers away would fire their missiles and turn around and head on back to Israel, because they knew that Iran had this formidable air defense. But this time, through this, you have to say, rather ingenious and daring plan, they were able to take out a lot of those air defense assets. So that's, and not only did they take out air defense assets, but apparently they took out a number of missiles and missile launchers that were kind of positioned for an immediate response. And so anyway, this was a blow. I have to admit it was a blow.
Oh yeah.
But the thing is, Iran is a big country, and they have been preparing for this for a long time. And that, the rumors are that they've got tens of thousands of missiles,
hundreds of thousands of missiles, and bases all over the place. Dozens of bases hidden under mountains that can take nuclear hits and all that stuff.
Right. So, you think about it. Okay, this hurt him, but this is like just the opening round, or not even the opening round in a 15-round fight.
Right.
And okay, yeah, he got one blow in. Iran, the Israelis did. Iran staggered a bit, but he's got a lot left, and we're already seeing the counter blow. There was, they said that they're going to respond. A lot of people started to actually ridicule or doubt the Iranians. Say, they're not. They always talk big. They never do anything. It'll be another one of these, demonstrative, attacks on the desert or something. They're not going to really hit back. They hit back. We've seen the videos over the last hour or two of strikes in Tel Aviv and in other cities in Israel, and you can see those missiles coming down fast and
a lot of them. A lot of them.
Right. I don't know what the total is so far. They say that I heard that there were 3 waves of attacks. The first one was directed at Tel Aviv. And then the second one to northern Israel. The third one was southern Israel and Tel Aviv again. And all of those led to impacts, I think, that did major damage. We'll find out. There's the videos are coming out now.
Here's let me show people. Here's one video, just so you'll see. You look right here. Okay, so here's a video, and in this video you can see, if you'll notice, so there I count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and they just keep coming. You can see them, and they ain't hitting, they're and look at this, they keep coming. Boom, boom, boom. Now you see an air defense. I don't know if that's the moon. It looks like air defense missiles are going off.
Right.
But they're just overwhelming it. And you can see them. They are hitting targets, and they are coming. So nobody's going to tell me that ain't doing a whole lot of damage. Right.
You see the occasional, I think, air defense hit. I don't really know how to analyze these photos, but sometimes you see an explosion in the air. That might be, air defense impacting one of these. But by and large, they're going through. They're not, unimpeded and striking the ground.
And they're hitting whatever their target is.
Yeah.
And it looks like a lot of them are going through one target, like they're taking out a base or something. It looks like a lot of them are hitting in one area, like they're sitting 20 or 30 missiles to take one base. So bottom line is, Israel's not walking away from this unscathed,
Right. Well, I think they understood that was going to happen. And you could say, in a way, that's part of the plan. Is to escalate until the U.S. comes in, and then they think that the U.S. is going to do the job for them,
right?
And it's kind of similar to the Ukrainian playbook, provoke, try to bring the U.S. in, try to bring in NATO in, because we know we can't win this on their own. I think Israel, that they have enough sense to understand they can't really win a war that's just between them and Iran. But they believe, that if they get the 800-pound gorilla in there, they can win this war.
And Andrei Martyanov said this a long time ago about Israel and Iran, and he said they're a long ways from each other, so they can throw things at each other. You know what I mean? And that's what you're going to get for the most part between these countries. Standoff missiles coming in 2 directions, and that just keeps happening until it stops for whatever reason. But that's kind of what we're looking at. I think that right now, the Iranians said, we know the Americans are involved, but I think right now they're just not taking the bait. I think it appears that the Iranians are not firing at U.S. positions and they're not taking the bait.
I think you're right. I know there's some statements that, the U.S. was involved, but I think they're going to, like you say, they're not going to take the bait. And it's clear, was it Marco Rubio tried to, put some distance between the U.S. and Israel's operation, its attack. But then just a few hours later, Mr. Big Mouth got on Truth Social and just basically said, yeah, this was the plan all along. This is great. This is, they didn't, do what I wanted in the negotiations. They were moving too slowly. So, we smacked them. Or he even put it more explicitly, I gave him 60 days. This attack occurred on day 61. That's essentially saying this is, that America was deeply involved. This was a joint U.S.-Israeli operation.
Well, here's the other thing about it too, and you got to look at this. Okay, they've been working on this for years. If you're building a house, if there's a guy next door and he starts building a house and it takes him 3 years to build a house, he wasn't going to partially build that house and then one day walk away and say, never mind. He intended to complete it from the very beginning. The fact that they've been working on this as long as they have, and particularly aligned with what happened in Russia, one could look at that and say, these were simultaneous actions that were identical. You know what I mean? And so likely some of the same strategists were involved. Some of the things, it's the same strategy. We're going to attack you from in your country. Your own country's big. We'll have some sneak bases in there. We'll have some underhanded people in there, maybe containers, whatever, and we'll play this game. If you're the Russians, you got to look at this. If you're the Russians, let me ask you this. You're the Russians. You look at this. What do you think?
Yeah, why are we talking to these Americans or the Ukrainians? What's going on? Because clearly, I think it's obvious that the Americans actually were coordinating with the Israelis, and they were, again, lulling. I think that was the word that was used actually by Israeli media, lulling the Iranians into a false sense of security. So they let their guard down, and this surprise attack became possible. So that is what the Americans were using the negotiations to achieve. Now, again, if you're the Russians, you got to look at that and think, hey, wait a second,
the Minsk Accords, we've been there.
Yeah, that's right. I think the Russians have already become very cautious. But if there was just a little sort of residue of hope, of trust in, let's say, in Putin or some of the other officials in the Kremlin, I think it's probably gone now. He says, we just.
Well, I'll put it like this, and I'm very close with a lot of the Russians. And there wasn't any. They knew what was going on. You know what I mean? Long ago, they figured out what was going on. I think, in my opinion, there was a game to be played, and the Russians are strategically wise. And they're like, okay, we'll play the game. We're sitting at the table. We're not. Then we'll say we're going to exchange some prisoners because we know we can do that, and we can get some bonus points and brownie points with our allies. I think the Russians were just playing chess. They know. I think the Russians long ago came to the conclusion we have to win this on the ground. And if we can talk to the Americans, it's better to talk. And at some point, we're probably going to have to sit down and talk when things are in our favor. So it's better if we already have a door open. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think that's true. That there was a time. Actually, Putin himself admitted, that he made a mistake of placing too much trust. We go way back to when the Minsk agreements were signed in 2014. He looks back at that. He was criticized at the time for it, and he said, "Yeah, I did make a mistake. I shouldn't have believed in them." But I think you're right, that it's been for the last couple of years or longer that they really understand. They now understand what's going on, and. And if they didn't understand fully, I think you're right that they did. But if there still was that residue of trust or hope, I think it's gone now, as a result of this Israeli operation and the Americans' involvement in it.
Let me ask you this. So a week or so ago, there was 20,000 anti-aircraft missiles, anti-air defense missiles, some kind of missiles were supposed to go to Ukraine. They rerouted them to Israel, which obviously was due to this. Okay, here's my point. What are you thinking right now if you're Ukraine? If you're in Kiev and you look at this,
we're screwed. I just really, I think seriously. I've seen comments. I don't know if it was actually a government official or it was some sort of leading journalist, but that's essentially what he said. It's just that, like, yeah, the spotlight is shifting over to the Middle East, and that is where all the surplus weapons are going to go. Until this war is over. There's no question about it. I think the Ukrainians don't have any illusions. When push comes to shove, those weapons are going to go to Israel. And yeah, they're going to, Ukraine's going to end up with the short end of the stick.
Let me be suspicious. Trump, I got to get out. I want to get out as quick as possible. I need a deal. Hurry up, get me a deal. I need a deal, right? One could look at this and suspect that this is where Trump wanted his war anyway. So that he's like, look, because they were preparing for it.
Mm-hmm.
They were preparing for this. So one could look at it and say Trump was in a way saying, guys, we're getting ready to attack Iran. You got to get me out of Ukraine. You got to get me out of this stuff. We're getting ready to go to war with Iran. Come on. What are we doing here? We need a deal as quick as possible so that we can go to war with Iran. Because isn't that what Biden did? We're leaving Afghanistan so we can go to war in Ukraine. That's kind of how the game works.
Oh, you may be right. Perhaps I gave Trump a little bit too much credit, or trying to see the good side to him, see the good intentions. They may still be there. Again, with Trump, it's hard to figure out what's going on because he's just so, he's all over the map. What is, who knows? But yeah, okay. Now in retrospect, it does seem that this was the plan all along. That's the way he's been talking. I think it was the plan, it's similar to what happened in Israel, between the IDF and Hamas. You had that ceasefire, we all celebrated. This is a good start to, a presidency, maybe things will actually turn out for the better. But then Netanyahu was basically saying, Trump told me I could tear this up, at the end of the first phase. That's what Israeli media was reporting. And then sure enough, that's what happened. There was just absolutely no effort to make the Israelis, move on to the next phase, to abide by the ceasefire. There wasn't. And it just seemed clear that from the start, this was just basically a ruse. It was just some time to buy, an effort to buy time, and then, to whatever, and then we see the same thing. I think, these negotiations, I think both of us actually believe that, and who knows, maybe at some level it's true that Trump actually wanted a deal. He was kind of hoping against hope that maybe he could, but it have to be on his terms, or the terms that his advisors were telling him. Basically, right, got to give everything up. And maybe there's part of him that foolishly, very naively believed that the Iranians would just surrender. But he always had it. He was serious when he said that in 60 days, we bomb the hell out of them if they don't do what I want. There was some deceptive talk, I think, that was intentionally deceptive at the end right there. It was a ruse. It was like, we're making progress or whatever. And I'm telling Netanyahu here, to hold off because, it looks like this diplomatic track. I hate to be so cynical, but this has really soured me on Trump. I was trying to hold on to some sort of positive interpretation of the guy, but it's hard to do that now.
Yeah, and what's interesting, when Trump came in and he was saying something about a deal, and the North Koreans immediately said, we're not doing a deal with the United States. They're untrustworthy. We don't need to talk to them.
Yeah,
they're untrustworthy at this point. The North Koreans were very early in the game saying, don't even waste your time. Don't call us. This is a waste of time. We don't want to talk to you, right? And now that they're aligned with the Russians, they really ain't going to talk to them. And might I add, let's be honest, they got nukes. So the U.S. ain't going to attack them. I mean, that's what people are learning. They got nukes. The U.S. ain't going to attack them.
Yeah.
But if this one thing is obvious, too. Now, let me throw this at you. This is not about nuclear weapons. This is about an attempt at regime change. Therefore, if they don't get the goal of regime change, haven't they lost the war? That's an interpretation.
Yeah. Well, you could certainly say that. If this goes on for weeks, Certainly Iran is going to suffer a lot of damage. But again, Israel is just a much smaller country. Again, the targets are clustered close together, a smaller population. They're dependent for something like 90% of their trade or their sea trade is through one port. Again, Iran can do tremendous damage, can really long term, right? I mean, can actually just wreck the economy of Israel. And sure, Israel can do damage to Iran, but Iran is a much larger, more resilient country. And this time it has, very powerful backers. So in the end, I think, unless, there's always the chance of some, there's another ingenious, operation that we can't foresee or whatever. But just looking at the kind of the raw statistics and the demographics and, the counting the missiles, you say this is really in Iran's favor. And so eventually, yeah, I think Iran's going to come out on top. I mean, I think
all they have to do.
And
at the end, they only got to do one thing, and that is maintain control of their government.
Right, exactly. I was just remembering your question at the end right there. It's just they have to be standing. And then in the end, okay, Israel has fired all its missiles. And that could happen sooner rather than later. Let's understand there's a real shortage of missiles, in NATO and in general within the collective West, including Israel. And the U.S. just doesn't have. They've already admitted, we don't have anything to give to Ukraine. We don't have our own stockpiles are depleted. So this might not last very long. It might just go for a couple of weeks, and then a lot of damage done to both sides, but even more to Israel because again they're smaller and more vulnerable. And then they run out of missiles, and then what happens? And then you say, and Iran's still standing, and everybody looks and say, what was that all about? What did you achieve? You just you basically shot yourself in both feet and achieve nothing, and the world just hates you even more. That's
and add this, and as it's certainly starting to appear, the Iranians' nuke sites, a lot of them they might have got damage on one. We're still getting that, but clearly, Iran has a bunch of nuclear sites that's way underground, and they maybe got damage on one or something above ground. But clearly, Iran still has most of their nuclear stuff. It wasn't severely damaged. They didn't do anything to address their capabilities realistically because they apparently at this point they really mostly can't. And so they'll get a little bit of, there was a website, there was an article that said they hit Natanz or something like that, and that maybe there was some nuclear something detected, some ions floating around or whatever the hell. And but most of their stuff's deep underground. So in the end, you've done all of this. You threw missiles back and forth. You've got F-35 shot down, pilots captured. You got to negotiate to get your pilot back, which is something you're gonna have to do. You have taken a beating back and forth from them because here's the thing. Okay, they threw Iran threw 300 missiles at them. They can throw 300 a day. They can probably throw a lot more than that a day for a lot of days. How long can Israel absorb that? And I don't think Israel has the U.S. Israel does not have the numbers.
Right. They don't. They really don't. I remember, I don't know. We don't have the statistics for this particular operation yet, but remember that first, I guess, is True Promise 1, the first time that the Iranians sent drones and missiles at Israel, and it was clearly demonstrative. But just to shoot down those drones, which were generally slow-moving old drones, and shoot down those cruise missiles, which again were generally older models. It was just part of a demonstration, and I think maybe an intelligence gathering operation by the Iranians. The reports are that something from $2 to $3 billion was spent by the various forces that helped in Israel. So Israel, the U.S., the UK, Jordan. When you added it up together, all the missiles they fire, all the fuel that was consumed, whatever, talking about $2 or $3 billion. That was one night. Now, if this goes on for weeks, where are we? Remember, like with the Houthis, I think the Americans ended up spending something like $3 billion, achieved nothing, and had to sue for peace, basically. We know that story, but it's just going to be all the worse. They just don't have the U.S. military, and I think the Israeli military too, is really designed for short fast wars. They have some very sophisticated equipment, but they don't have a lot of it, and it tends not to be very durable. And when you get into a war of attrition, I think they're at a disadvantage, and we're going to see that.
That's apparently Tel Aviv.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So it ain't all. Yeah, that's going to leave a mark. But that's the thing about it. So it's interesting to watch the emotions of people. There were a lot of people who were just depressed. Oh no, as if they felt that there's a decapitation strike and just Iran's done. It's finished. They can't. They're just like limping around. And Iran was like, okay, now it's our turn. It was kind of like, you ever see V for Vendetta when they shoot the guy and he says, "My turn."
Okay.
I was like,
I never watched that whole movie.
Oh,
but I should.
Great movie. That's like a classic.
I know. I should sit down and watch that one.
Yeah, that's definitely what works. But that's basically now. So it's now. So now I guess the Israelis are going to shoot back or something like that. And,
right. Well, they promised that they will, and I think it was their defense minister Israel Katz just said that Iran has attacked one of our population centers. And they've crossed all the red lines. And I just think, isn't Tehran a population center? Wait a second here. What is it?
And add this: across all the red lines, you're literally starving people to death.
Yeah, I know. It's just the hypocrisy of it is just breathtaking. But yeah, they say, and I think I think they were expecting this. This is something that the Iranians didn't want to do, but this time they just had to do it. They had to say, okay, we don't want to be in this all-out war. It's going to be nasty. A lot of people are going to die. A lot of innocent people. Whoa.
Yeah, it's a lot happening.
Yeah.
Another thing I think, and this is something that is an issue that Israel has that a lot of other countries don't have, and that is, I believe at some point, it's something they're already experiencing, and that is a lot of Israelis are from New Jersey, Moscow, Brooklyn. Why the heck would you stay? If you've got a citizenship on someone else and missiles are raining down, why would you stick around?
Right.
I mean, I think there are a lot of people are going to leave. Yeah.
No, I think a lot have left already. I can't remember what is it, 300,000 have left already. It was just a number similar to like the number of people who initially left Russia at the start of the SMO. Now, a lot of those people have come back, but the Western media made a great deal about it. These people ran off. They were afraid of getting conscripted or whatever. But you look at it as a percentage of the Russian population, it was really very, very small. And again, quite a few of those people returned. But in the case of Israel, 300,000 people leaving Israel, that's a major chunk. And you're right, there are hundreds of thousands of other dual citizens who are probably right now, checking airline ticket prices. So
and it's kind of like this. I was in New Orleans on a Friday, and I was watching the news, and I saw Hurricane Katrina had just crossed the lower Florida and turned towards New Orleans, and it said it's a Category 1, but it'll probably be Category 5. And I was like, well, I guess I'll be back heading to the airport here. I packed my stuff and drove straight to the airport. I didn't ask how much. When's the next flight heading east? I don't really care if it's going my way home. Fine. If I got to go to friggin' Schenectady and come back to Baltimore, beat up guys with that, I'll do it. You know what I mean? At that point, it's like any place but here.
Right.
Do you have a ticket? Yes, anywhere but here.
Yeah, right. I don't. Just give me a random ticket. It just has to go away from this airport. Right.
And I think that's what you're going to start to see.
Well, I think you're
they
right.
only got like four major giant, really big, 4 or 5 in Israel, electrical, big power plants.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's it doesn't take too many strikes to knock out the power or just completely cut down all seaborne traffic or shipments. Right. And again, Iran can do that because Israel is a small country, and Israel they can hurt Iran, but it's not going to be the same. Iran's going to survive. One thing too is just that even if, it doesn't quite go that far, but but even with those strikes that we just saw in those videos, I think that's probably already had a huge psychological impact. Because one thing that Israel's had for a long time is a sense of invincibility. I think going all the way back to the 6-Day War in 1967. It's just like, we are the Colossus here. And that sense of invincibility has, allowed has brought people into Israel. People have built up companies and so on. So they believed in the future of Israel. But these kind of actions, especially as this war goes on for a while, and we see these kind of strikes night after night, that's going to be gone. And a lot of people say this place is not safe. That idea of investing my life's fortune to start a business here, I think I'm going to reconsider. You're going to find another piece of land somewhere in the world. This is not a good place to do this. It's going to have. I don't think Israel in the long run is going to recover from this. I'm not predicting the imminent demise of Israel, but they have been mortally wounded. And I think we're going to see, Israel circling the drain over the next several years.
Also, your thoughts on the political fallout here. Donald Trump, I'm the peace president. I'm going to do this. I'm going to make things better, blah, blah. And everybody listened, and I listened. And I said, well, he said this, and who knows? Maybe it'll happen. I hope it'll happen. Yeah. Perhaps he'll do something. The Democrats weren't saying it. Now, I think in light of the attack on Russia, which is, Trump's particular in light of this, I mean, his excuse that he didn't know is dubious at best, shall we say.
Yeah.
But looking at all that's happening, I'm looking online and I'm seeing a lot of the MAGA people saying, we've been had, we've been took. I think there's going to be a political, he had a coalition. And there were a lot of people in his new coalition that weren't MAGA people. They just jumped on board and said, the system hates him. I'll vote for him. Things are too high. I'll vote for him. A lot of that coalition is going to be, he's going to lose a big part of his coalition over this.
Yeah, well, potentially. I think, obviously already people who are really paying attention are upset. We can call them, the principled megaists or whatever. There are a lot of people who don't pay that much attention, who just trust Donald Trump. One thing I think we need to all remember, because we're geopolitical nerds and we pay a lot of attention to all these things, most people don't. And for most people, it's just, pocketbook issues that come first. And then foreign affairs, foreign policy is way down the list. I think that's a mistake because in the end, the president can do a lot more good or bad, evil, as commander in chief. And when you come to the economy, it's actually hard for a president to turn around the economy and do anything really sensible. But he can make good or bad decisions with huge consequences in the foreign policy arena. So I think it really makes sense to vote on that. But most people don't see it that way. It's only 4%, according to a poll I saw, I think around the time of the recent election, only 4% put foreign policy first. But here's the big exception, is that if it's happening overseas, a lot of people don't care. It may be really stupid, but they just don't care. But if there's an impact back home, either American soldiers start to come back in body bags, or there's a real humiliation, like an American ship is sunk or a base is wiped out, or maybe most importantly of all, it's like the Strait of Hormuz gets closed and shut down, and then oil prices, are through the roof. Then people are going to get mad. I think then, and this, it looks like all of that is now very much a possibility. Almost a likelihood. When you look at this war, it's going to be hard to keep the U.S. out of it. And if the U.S. gets involved, I think the U.S. Again, there are people in the U.S. that want to get involved. The Israelis clearly want them to get involved. Netanyahu wants the U.S. to get involved. I think that's the plan all along. And I'm afraid that we will be involved. And then all those terrible things that are going to anger, Trump's base, those are going to happen. And then you're right. I think it'll be the end of Trump.
I think you're right. Here we go right now. Boom, BBC. Global oil prices soar after Israeli attacks Iran. 10% up. Right. So that means everything's going to, stock markets closed down. Dow Jones fell. everything. So the bottom line is this, I think, and that's the thing about it. When people, okay, 10%, let's say people feel, 40 cents a gallon more, they ain't gonna be happy. Especially people with businesses. I got a tractor, I got to fill for my farm, I got a boat, I got to fill for my waterman, business, I got a tractor trailer, all of that. When you talk about a 10%, and I got a pair of 200-gallon tanks on my tractor trailer, 10% is really hurts my gut, gets into my bottom line. And some guys got 4 tractor trailers, and I know a guy that has 4, and he drives one, he's got other 3, and he complains about, man, when I got to fill up $700, $800, $900, $1,000 worth of 10% now $100.
Right. Extra. Well, it can be the difference between, a profit and a loss, between having to your business being viable and having to shut it down. So that's somebody can be your life's work. It really depends on those things. So, and 10%, 10% is nothing compared to what could happen if the Strait of Hormuz gets shut down. And if it really does get shut down, right now that 10% is just the general nervousness, but nothing's really happened yet. That's just a taste of what could very well happen. Just a small taste of it.
If something kinetic happens, and for instance, if the Iranians, let's say they don't say, well, we're going to shoot we're not closing it down, but they say, well, we're going to mine it. So it's effectively closed down. We're not shooting at anybody. You want to try to go through it? Best of luck, but it's loaded with mines.
Yeah.
And now somebody's got to go in and demine it. Well, you know what? It's going to take a while to demine it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as soon as the oil market's here, the Straits of Hormuz is closed down, and that actual oil can't go through.
Right.
But I think they're wise for this reason. The Saudis have condemned it. Well, where does the Saudis' oil go through? The Straits of Hormuz. So I think to some extent, don't you think the Iranians are playing a chess game, and they want to keep as much support as they can from the Gulf states, so they don't want to hit them and hurt them unless they absolutely have no other choice.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. That's something that they're keeping in their back pocket. That's something that's really a last resort. I think, first of all, they don't want to strike the American assets. And then they have all those kind of doomsday options. Yeah. If Israel keeps on pressing the attack, keeps on, really threatens the existence of the Iranian state, and America becomes involved, then they're going to say, well, look, if we're in danger of going down, we're going to do this. And they can do it very easily. It'll be easier for them to do that than to actually strike Tel Aviv. It will be very easy for them to do that.
Their version of a nuclear option.
Right.
If you threaten the existence of our state, we're going to close it down. We're going to hit all your bases. And by the way, sorry about all this Gulf states, but all your oil infrastructure's got to go.
Yeah.
It's got to go. All of it's got to go. Missiles everywhere. And then now at that point, when it's no longer about an inconvenience. It becomes economic collapse, literally economic collapse.
Yeah, no, it could have a huge impact. I mean, 30% of internationally traded oil goes through that strait. And you take that off the market, and the price of oil will double, triple, quadruple.
And where people buy oil from? Russia.
Right.
I also think, don't you think it's possible that, let's just say, things go bad, they start going really bad there. If I'm Russia, I might be inclined to break out the Oreshniks and do decapitation strikes in Kyiv. If I'm Russia, I may be inclined to say it's time for that decapitation strike that I've been putting off. If I'm China and the U.S. is bogged down and it's a mess and they're fighting and they're losing bases and God knows what's happening, probably some bases in Africa will be hit. If I'm China, I say, Taiwan, you've been getting on my nerves. And I might surround Taiwan. I've always felt that the Chinese do not want to bomb Taiwan. They want to surround it, you know what I mean? And they cut it off and they'd say, okay, we need to negotiate. I think that would be their ploy. If they really don't want to do that, but they would. Right. But if things go to a point where we get to that level, I think it's possible that Russia and China could say, well, you know what, you're so busy over there, we're going to make our move now because there's nothing you can do about it. And that's a possibility.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, that's one thing that, the spotlight's on Iran. And not only that, it's more importantly, it's actually the materials are going in there. There's ships. Like I think I just saw today that some, major American naval vessels were redirected to the Middle East. Those are naval vessels that cannot be in the South China Sea. And then, and again, talking about Ukraine, all those Patriot interceptors or whatever, they're not going to Ukraine anymore. Not that they were doing a whole lot of good, but
Right.
but they're just not. They're going to the few that they have. They're going to be going to Israel, and so the U.S. is going to have essentially its hands tied. It's going to be stuck, mired in the Middle East, and that does kind of give kind of just more room for action for both the Chinese and the Russians. I think that's correct.
Yeah, I'm seeing settlers. 40 wounded settlers have been confirmed, with some in critical condition or pulled out of the rubble.
Interesting. Where was that?
Yeah, that's on Telegram. So you never know how much of this stuff is on Telegram.
Yeah, it's not always correct, but
yeah, so you get a lot. You got to kind of weed through it.
Right.
So who knows?
Right.
I don't know. And I knew we'd see this. Iranian MP urges Khomeini to build nukes.
Right. Yeah, well, that's another thing we haven't talked about, but that's a possible consequence of this. That again, the Iranians will conclude that, hey, clearly, the only way to assure our own security is to do what North Korea did. You just look at, I think probably many governments in the world looked at what happened in Libya and then what happened in North Korea, and they, they actually drew their conclusions there. And I'm sure Iran is finding that case very, very persuasive. It just said, okay, yeah, we tried to do it, to work, to negotiate something, to work through diplomacy, and look what's happened. Now they can't do that anymore. I mean, it's just the depth of the treachery here is again, you could say the Iranians were fools for, they've been burned many times, but they said, okay, we'll try it once more. We'll try, this is the best thing. It really would be the best thing if we could have a peaceful settlement. But now, maybe I think they were, much wiser, very cautious, rather pessimistic, but we'll give it one final try. But I think that was the final try. Right now, I can't see them ever going back to the negotiating table. So what's the option? It may very well be a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I'm reading, let's see. Turkish media, Iran targeted Tel Aviv Financial District, IDF headquarters, Ministry of Economy, Telnaf Air Base, air defense locations in the Haifa area, gas platform.
Gas platform, interesting.
I figured that to do that. They're so yeah. Well, we're going to see what happens. I don't know, but I want to ask you something else. Well, bottom line is this too. When you look at what happened, the Minsk Accords, when you look at what happened with this particular so-called negotiating, when you look at the way Soleimani was killed, he was told that they were going to negotiate, right?
Right.
I think they're at a point right now that if the U.S. says we want to negotiate with anyone, I think, like, for instance, the Russians, I know the Russians, they'll say, sure, we'll sit down at a negotiating table, but they're not negotiating.
Right. Well, they'll negotiate, but they're not going to slow down their advance on the battlefield. Yeah. And they're not going to slow down their strikes, just like, okay, we'll show up to this table, but we're not doing anything different.
That's what I mean. They'll sit down at the negotiating table,
right,
and they will talk to the Americans, but they won't really negotiate. They won't see it as, in my opinion, they'll know what they're up against,
right,
which is not a real negotiation. If I have no confidence that you'll keep your word, and I feel that you're hiding a knife under the table so I can turn my back, you'll stick it in my back. I'm sitting far away from the table. I'm listening to everything you say. I take notes and I'm going back, and we'll plot and plan on it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. This isn't the first time that, of course, the Israelis and the Americans have used negotiations to actually carry out decapitation strikes. Actually, Nasrallah, apparently, he was meeting to discuss a possible ceasefire, some kind of settlement with the Israelis.
Right.
And that was what brought them together. And it was just a ploy. This is at least, one interpretation of the events, but that's
what I heard the same.
Yeah, very believable, in light of what just happened. We'll just kind of entice them with the promise of a peace treaty or some sort of ceasefire, and then we'll, slit their throats.
Iran Channel 3, Iran may close the Straits of Hormuz, and Yemen may close Bab al-Mandab Straits. Both options are currently under consideration. Okay, well, that's a threat.
Yeah.
You know what I
they're
mean?
just letting them know, hey, we can do this. It's just, we'll see where you go. Right. I mean, it's, who knows, but everything's possible now. I mean, we've released the dogs of war, and it's going to, who knows where this is going to end.
If that happens, in a way, that's kind of it for Trump, for MAGA, because they're going to be pissed, because one of the things they wanted was Trump to deal price. There's a lot of MAGA people that if they wake up and it's like, hey, bad news, gas increase, how much? It's $14 a gallon now. It's $11 a gallon. But the good news is you can't buy it anywhere because most gas stations don't have gas. But when they do, you can buy it for $11 a gallon. At that point, MAGA's the people, as we say, a lot of people that don't pay attention, they will pay attention. The old, what was the old Verizon advertisement? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. No question about it.
So your thoughts on where you see this thing before we go, where you would see this thing going over the weekend?
Over the weekend. Okay, well, the Israelis have promised retaliation. Now we could see, is it going to be more of the same? I guess one of my worries is that Iranian communications has been severely compromised. Clearly the Israelis had some good intelligence. Mossad had good intelligence, probably real-time intelligence on the location of these different leaders. And this is, of course, we saw that happen in Lebanon. And remember, after that initial strike that killed Nasrallah and the other, generals, and also killed hundreds of civilians, it was something that we got to remember. Nasrallah was replaced, the others were replaced, but then the Israelis got them, and it was just one after another. They clearly knew where everybody was. They had moles, I think, within Hezbollah. It's the only way to explain it. They had severely compromised their Hezbollah security. Now, I don't know that that's happened in Iran, but there's a chance. Clearly they have managed to infiltrate, and Mossad has had some rather spectacular successes. Now, will it continue, or have they just, they've blown their cover, it's all over, and Iran's cracking down? So that's the big question. If we see more decapitation strikes, successful decapitation strikes, then I think Iran has a serious problem that they're going to have to solve very, very quickly. But that may have been it. It's just that now Iran understands what's going on. Okay, we took our eye off the ball. We weren't completely prepared for this. They caught us by surprise, but now we know what's going on, and we're, kicking everything into high gear. Again, clearly the Iran's air defense system has been degraded to some extent. We don't know how much, and how possible it is to repair it and to replace this equipment. We'll find out. But Israel might get in another, severe blows, especially before the air defense system is reconstituted, if that's possible. So we could see something rather similar happening this weekend, or, over the next couple of days. But I have no doubts that Iran will respond, probably with an even more forceful response than what we saw, which was really quite impressive, and clearly did some very serious damage, where it counts, in places like Tel Aviv and Haifa and, and so on and so forth. I heard that they actually even hit a nuclear facility. I saw one report. That hasn't been confirmed. I think it was a nuclear research center within Israel. And it's probably just going to escalate from there. The Netanyahu is gambling. I think this has always been his approach, is that we'll go up that escalation ladder until the point where, we're stuck and we're like a cat in the tree, and then the Americans have to come to our rescue.
And at that point, that's it for Trump. Well, and last thing, since 9 minutes, it'll be an hour. So I'll throw one more thing at you.
Okay.
And that is the other thing I was going to say is, at some point, you get to that point, and then I think Trump, it's already clear the decision he's going to make is whatever the Zionists want. But at that point, I think he's approaching a point where he could lose. I think there is a point where Trump could lose his base. And he's approaching that point. And I don't know if he understands it. I don't know if he even gives a crap. He might say, hey, what the heck? I can't get elected again. Why would I care? Trump's the type that may say that. But as this thing escalates, that's the potential.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't claim to understand what goes on in Trump's mind, and I have my suspicions about anybody who does claim to understand. But I do think that he enjoys the adulation. He likes having this base. I think he would be sorry to lose it. It's not just about the money, just keeping in the mega donors' good graces. So, if he sees that happening. Again, I think it was the last time you said, well, Trump does have a reverse gear, and we might see him do yet another 180. That's the thing. Trump is just not reliable. I don't think either side can ever think that, okay, yeah, we got him on our side. He's on our team, and now everything's going to be fine. He's always capable of flip-flops. And I think even now, unfortunately, all the advantages are to the Zionists because he's just surrounded himself with Zionists, and he's shown himself to be a Zionist over the years. Let's be honest, but still, it's not impossible that he could do another flip flop at some point. He's spectacular. I mean, if he is just like, it's the equivalent. It's the mental or rhetorical equivalent of doing a triple flip in the air. He gets up and he does it again and again. And just okay.
Let me ask you this. When this first happened, and like my friends were texting me and sending me messages and all, and I looked at it, and here's what popped into my mind. We got some kind of very suspicious, to be quite frank, No Kings gigantic protest coming up this week. I'm very suspicious about that. I've looked into it a lot. But meanwhile, we've got riots in LA, and they're kind of out of control. So we've got this unrest at home. We've got a proxy war with the nuclear power over here that, shall we say, ain't going well.
Right.
Now we've got the Middle East that is a complete and total regional war. Could you make an argument that the United States is a failed state in some ways? I mean, are we approaching that kind of?
Yeah.
That may be a little over the top.
Yeah.
But are we starting to approach an area where you can start to have that kind of conversation that this is not a stable country?
Yeah, I think so. I really do. I mean, it's just that, first of all, the polarization is obvious, and it's become increasingly extreme, over the years. But then also the general loss of trust in institutions, in particular the federal government. I was looking at the polling data recently, and it's down to 22%. Of the people actually believe that the federal government they can trust it to do the right thing. Most of the time. To give you an idea of how far we've fallen, back in, I think it was 1964, it was 76%. So 22% is real low, and that's what you find throughout really all the Western world. So that tells you there is a real crisis of legitimacy, and there just seems to be no sign, of really, any party that has some kind of way out of this. It's just sort of it's all the same. More of the same. It's a lot of the partisan bickering and the virtue signaling and all that. It's just there's very little of substance. And meanwhile, all the most stupid policies, namely the wars, they go on. It doesn't matter, it seems, if it's Biden or if it's Trump or whoever. It's just like the worst policies that are leading us towards destruction continue. I wouldn't say that we're a failed state, but the only reason is that we're sort of like, there is just some sort of leftover, maybe capital from all the previous decades when America really was a superpower, and so there still is you have to still say that by world standards, we're still prosperous. All in all, our bureaucracies work pretty efficiently. They're not nearly as corrupt as a lot of others. But when you look at you look at the people that are in charge, they're just, they're deranged and they're incompetent. And then you look at the consequent loss of faith on the part of the population, and you see the absence of any solution, and just look at the general trajectory. it's like, whatever we're looking at, economics or foreign policy, it's just that we're on a bad trajectory that's just taking us to bad places. It seems like, we're not a failed state yet, but it seems like, we've got a captain that is is looking at failed state ahead and is steering us in that direction. I don't know.
Yeah, we're looking at the rocks, and I'll put it like this: it seems over the last couple of years, every so often we hit the iceberg and we back up and like we didn't hit it hard enough, full speed ahead, wham, and we hit Russia, we hit an iceberg in Ukraine. What do you want to do? Well, there's another nice iceberg over there in Iran. Let's go swing into that one. And meanwhile, we threaten China.
Right.
War is imminent with China. We've got to destroy them with an economic attack. And you're like,
yeah, I know. It's just one thing after another. I mean, they're just piling on. You can hardly keep up with it. That's what. And I think we're actually living on borrowed time. Just to say that we still there's enough of the old United States left that we have, at least. That we're holding together, but we're holding together, it seems, just by duct tape and gum, and at some point it's gonna fall apart very soon.
And I feel like this, again, a chess move by Iran. Iran is saying, look, we're going to throw missiles back and forth. We know right now our air defense has been degraded. Certain things have happened. Israel can hit us. They're hitting us. And they know we can hit them, and we're going to hit them. Okay, that's the game we're playing. Fine, we're going to play that game. Don't take it too far. They're saying, we're playing that game. We have another card we can pull out.
Right.
You don't want us to pull that out.
Right.
So don't go too far doing anything stupid, because if you try to take this thing too far, the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Well, and I've suspected this all along. I suspect the Houthis have far more highly technological missiles and things than they've used, and that they have the ability to do a lot more damage. And I'll say this: the Iranians will pull their punches, the Houthis won't. Mm-hmm. The Houthis see an American ship and they can sight in on it, they'll sink it. The Houthis, they're doing God's work. You ain't going to pull. They don't believe in. They don't have a reverse gear.
Yeah, well, they have the advantage of being the poorest country in the Arab world, meaning that we don't have anything to lose. We got our sandals and our robes, and I got some dates and whatever to eat tonight. But it's maybe I shouldn't say that, but they just don't. They don't have that built up infrastructure. I said, man, it would be a shame if that whole thing was just smoking ruins. What are you going to do? You're going to make holes in the sand. You're going to knock off the top of this rock pile here. And I don't care. I'm going to sink your ship.
Right. The Saudis have knocked it off 12 times.
Right.
So whatever. It's just a little bit. It's a little, down a little bit further. You might as well hit it 8 or 10 more. What do we care?
Right.
So that's I think that's the card they played now. We're going to throw missiles back and forth. If you try anything too far, it was a signal. That's the next move.
Yeah. If anything, I say this war could have a lot of terrible outcomes, but I think that the best ending that I could see would be a Houthi-like ending. It's like, okay, Israel just tries to pound them, and it goes on and on and then Israel runs out of missiles, and then Israel declares victory and stops. It's just, it asks for a ceasefire. And well, of course, a lot of Israel is going to be in ruins, but at least we're going to come. The war could end, and short of a nuclear holocaust, which or a global economic catastrophe or whatever. That's the best that could happen.
And then whoever it is can say, okay, Israel, you wanted your war with Iran, you got your war with Iran.
Yeah,
didn't work out the way you wanted. So, because Trump does have that reverse gear, and potential that it could get to a point where Trump could say, this is we're throwing good money for bad. Like, this is not working right now. I'll put it like this: the F-35s getting shot down is not a good thing for the U.S. because they sell a lot of F-35s and they're telling everybody how stealthy and great they are and all of that right off the bat. Yeah, that could keep happening.
Right.
So.
And that was just the first day, apparently 2 went down. I guess it hasn't, it looks at one, I think is we can say is confirmed. we've seen the video. They say
Yes.
they captured the pilot. The other hasn't been confirmed, but if it's whether it's one or two, that's a bad start for Israel.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Once again, Peter Erickson, he has a great channel. It's called Conversation Among the Ruins. And that's kind of scary right now. I don't know about that name right now, Peter Erickson. It might be a little too appropriate. But whatever the case may be, it's a great channel. Check it out. Make sure you go there. Make sure you subscribe. Also, if you're not subscribed to this channel, make sure you become a subscriber. You can follow me on Rockfin, follow me on Telegram, follow me on Rumble. All that kind of stuff, Facebook, whatever the heck. And of course, if you want to donate, PayPal, Patreon, and all that kind of stuff, buy me a coffee. And the most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. And like I tell everyone in the chat all the time, in the alternative media, you are the most important part of alternative media. If you see this video or one of Peter's video or any video that you like, you watch it and you're like, that was an informative, opinionated video, and I liked it. Share it on your social media platforms so you can get this stuff out here and more people can see it. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. We're out.